Hi, my name is Louise Doyle. I'm the co-founder of Mesma and I'm also a strategic associate with SDN.
Can we talk about the future of quality in apprenticeships?
We can. It's a nice big question. I'll start, before I talk about the future of it, I'll talk about where we are now. So, Ofsted isn't everything, however, we all understand it, so let me use it as a benchmark. We've got about 59% of our apprenticeship provision, I think it is, as good or better at the moment. And let's, clap that 59%, but actually recognise that that's a really big gap that aren't at that point yet. So that's a couple of things. Number one, that's about inspections in a year, so it's risk-based. Number two, that's not apprenticeship providers, that's apprenticeship provision. So that's actually also the subgrades that sit in providers that do more than apprenticeships. And number three, what I always do is to say, well, let's compare that in how we might look at other parts of the system that are also inspected by Ofsted, and they are more or less at 80%. So actually the gap is really quite significant. So what I always say to the providers that we support is let's keep finding that 1% extra. How do we make sure that actually the direction of travel we take is aiming towards making sure that on as level a playing field as it ever will, then we're starting to see that 58% creep up, because actually from a trend point of view, it hasn't really got any better. Regardless of the reforms, we've got 3-4 years of it hovering somewhere around the same mark. So there's nothing we can do about what's gone, but we can do something about what's going forward. So quality in future, I think we've got some risks that we need to take into account, and we need to think about how we lean into those risks in a way that is appropriate to develop them. So number one, the employer, as I often say, that this kind of champion and thief of apprenticeship quality. So they're with the apprentice 80% of the time, let's not forget that. They play a crucially important role, and as any provider will tell you, and any trainer or assessor will tell you, if you're having to drag the employer or the line manager actually kicking and screaming through an apprenticeship, then you've got yourself a quality issue. Where actually what we need is the employer to be as engaged in that as they ought to be. Now what I think the reforms has done is it's kick-started that question right at the beginning. So we're seeing more caution over the type of employer that providers are willing to work with, the level of briefing that they might do to support them. So that's number one for me. Let's always think about how we make sure that the employer is doing the bit that they need to do if we want to have a quality apprenticeship, because it's the provider that gets stung actually ultimately, isn't it? Number two, I think we've got a risk around curriculum. So because of the history of the way apprenticeships have come about, this idea of designing a curriculum is common to some, but actually for a lot of apprenticeship providers, we've been so driven by quite a rigid framework. The notion of designing a curriculum hasn't really come through. So we've got a new framework coming in that's going to push that question. So we have to really think through how we are doing what we do for the right reasons, and that actually we're going through that process of thinking about the sequencing of the curriculum, what it is that we're trying to achieve in order to make sure that we keep getting those 1%. I think my third risk would be is the very reason that we, or the thing that we speak most about at the moment is endpoint assessment. So I think there's lots of good things about EPA coming in. I'm a real supporter of it. The risk is as we start teaching to the test. So we need to learn those lessons, think backwards, look at what's happening in schools, look at where Ofsted are going, and actually say, let's make sure that that's not the space that we end up in. And we are the only people that can make sure that we're responding to that correctly. So they would be my three. Employer, make sure they're a champion of your quality. Number two would be around curriculum design and really thinking that through, making sure we've got the right expertise. And number three would be around use EPA for what it's good for, but let's make sure the whole curriculum doesn't get constricted to the point that that's all we're about. And then we'll keep chipping away those 1% until we're somewhere near that 80% like all other bits of the education system are.